Shalom. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Esti and Osnat, for inviting me. It's an absolute honor to be here. It's a very emotional day. I'm very happy to be part of it. As I think Osnat said, my Hebrew isn't that excellent. I studied product design, and I focus on footwear. I'm going to talk actually mostly about one project that kind of started percolating and starting to be part of my brain when I was here in Israel a couple of years ago during the Jerusalem Center for Visual Arts residency. But I will also explain a little bit where my practice is and where it's going and why it's a different project from what I traditionally do. So, kind of the main aim of my projects is to look at the typology of women's footwear. And I think it's a very interesting subject matter because I quite soon realized when I was designing shoes that every shoe that you see kind of represents a style cliche. So slutty or girly or sporty or even androgynous, they really fit in very specific style cliches, and I think as a result they kind of conform women to these roles. And my main aim is to open that spectrum up aesthetically, but also how the shoes are made. So I'll actually show you. When you Google girly shoes, this is the kind of spectrum of shoes that come up, and sporty as well. So there's kind of aesthetic rules, colors, materiality that kind of make the shoes adhere to it. Then you also, of course, have shoe types, which are more kind of based in a kind of functional, with a functional background. So, for example, the brogue was invented for actually Scottish and Irish wetlands. So farmers would walk over like extremely wet farmland, and the shoes were made in such a way that the water would seep into the shoe and could very easily also seep out of it, so you could keep your feet as dry as possible. And what I think is quite interesting about that is that nowadays a brogue has a very different connotation. So even though that the shoe is very similar in its design, it's based on these broguing perforations, the context of the shoe is completely changed. But rather than doing something that the fashion industry does a lot by looking at historical types and designs, I'm trying to kind of make up my own set of rules and my own aesthetic and design. And I mainly do that through looking at different ways of producing the shoe. So I'm looking at the materiality, the construction of things. So this is a chart where you see where a kind of conventional shoe is made with kind of three elements that you usually see, which is the upper, so the top part of the shoe, the sole, and the heel. But those three elements are, within this construction technique, always separated, even though, of course, the shoe designers are trying to pretend that it isn't. There's still these three parts. So I'm really trying to find different ways of making the shoe to become more sculptural with it. So this is an example of a shoe I did quite a long time, probably 10 years ago now. It's basically, I call it leather mache, so it's a paper mache, but translated in leather. So the shoe traces the foot on the inside completely, but then it's built up on the outside. And what's nice about footwear, it's something that I, of course, as a product designer love, is that as soon as you start changing one element of a shoe, the whole thing starts shaking. You have to design your way out of the problem that you give yourself. So, for example, the fact that the shoe can't bend in the front, you have to design a new way of walking or actually making that happen. So with this shoe, the toe is actually quite high up, so you roll your foot. So this is the same technique, but with bigger sheets, also making it more abstracted. And also every element is part of the technique. So there's no, like every design solution, such as the heel and the front, are come out of the technique. This is actually the only shoe that I've ever made that cannot possibly be worn, which is quite nice because most people either believe that all of them are, yeah, of course, they're shoes, so they're wearable, or vice versa. But I made another version. So they're carbon fiber and clad in leather. And this is the kind of the next iteration of the same shoe. This time, rather than using 3-part molds, a 2-part mold, which ultimately also means that the three-dimensionality of this shoe, because it has to be made in 2 parts, adds strength to the shoe. But so that's kind of a little bit some examples of shoes I've done. Very often I also exhibit the process and speak about the kind of value of the machine-made and handmade, and how things are presented in the kind of a luxury industry. But I soon kind of realized that when you design something, even it's not just the process by which you make it, but it's also the process of thinking about the project that could do with a bit of updating or rethinking. So I started a project during a Stanley Picker Research Fellowship in 2011, where I actually looked at a kind of more the methodology by which you design something. So I looked at this factory, which is a Richard Rogers, I can never say that in one good sentence, where it's basically kind of a design or an engineering method that defines all the different parameters that this building, in his case, needed to adhere to. So he said, I want to make a factory floor that has absolutely no columns on the inside, which meant that all the kind of construction and the water supply, the air supply, the air conditioning, every kind of infrastructure is happening on the outside of the building. So by setting the parameters, you also design in some way how the building looks, but I'll talk about that a little later. Actually, yeah, so this is a part that's also quite interesting. If you do work in this kind of logic way of setting parameters, then a kind of question came up in my mind where if you set up these parameters, which is kind of a logic, really kind of a logic methodology, then what happens to aesthetics? Is there how does that play a role in parametric design? And I kind of think, because you could ultimately say if you are designing a bridge and you set the parameters, the length, the width, the height, the amount of traffic that goes over it, the budget that you have, you ultimately kind of come to a certain conclusion. But ultimately, I also think that a designer doesn't make those decisions separately. There's a kind of built-in intuition that makes the two come together. And I actually found a little bit of some kind of proof of this in this book called Why Buildings Stand Up. And it's about the kind of the relationship between structural correctness and aesthetics. So he claims that if an I-beam isn't used in the correct structural way, it will never be a beautiful object or a beautiful building. But going back to the project, I started to define all the parameters that a shoe needs to adhere to. A shoe, of course, in a high-heeled position while in motion. And as you can see, as soon as I started writing like 2 or 3 sentences, the more questions actually rose up. Because there's so many different elements that you need to make a decision on. For example, what kind of movement? Is it walking? Is it tiptoe? And then there were also things like, for example, the surface or the substrate that you walk on really changes what this object would ultimately be like. Let's say if it was quicksand, of course you get a completely different shoe end result than on a concrete surface. And that led me to kind of also looking at the shoe in a more cultural perspective. But again, I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. So this is actually the fellowship is a fellowship that runs for a year and a half, that is part of Kingston University, where you get the time and place to work with staff there. It's a university that's not only arts and design, but also a kind of more broader university. And this is, so every fellowship ends up in an exhibition. So this is the exhibition shot. And the exhibition is called A Measurable Factor Sets the Conditions of Its Operation, which is, I will never ever make up such a long title for a show, because first of all, graphically it's just awful, and to say it at a talk, I've really struggled in the past. But anyway, it's actually the explanation of what a parameter is. Now, if you look at engineering in footwear design, of course you can say that a high-heeled shoe is a example of engineering where steel was used probably about in the 1950s. They still kind of in two minds about who actually invented it, but you can say that that's a piece of engineering, but it hasn't changed very much since. And I think it's quite interesting to think about fashion in that sense, like what engineering means in the fashion industry. What does it add to? What is it used for? So I think in footwear, it really hasn't changed that much. Even if you see quite a lot of kind of sculptural-looking shoes recently, they're always still in the kind of structural sense of it, completely conventional, or hasn't changed in the last 100 years. But of course, in shoes and engineering, there's a lot happening in sports. And these shoes here on the right bottom, they're actually shoes you wear in a mine field. So they're designed very specifically for that. Now here there's a slide of when engineering is used in fashion, and it's very often used to kind of engineer shape or posture, which is of course not just about performance, but it's about very particular type of performance. And very often it also kind of changes the woman into a machine. So when the crinoline was first invented, you got all of a sudden these prints in fashion magazines that kind of pretended that the woman was actually a machine and was kind of drawn as a engineering diagram. Again, going back to this project, what I realized that there were so many different parameters, so I had to kind of focus on one in particular, and I studied kind of the anatomics and the kinematic movement of the foot and the leg. And I read stacks and stacks of reports on footwear and what is good for you and what isn't. And of course, every single conclusion of these reports are the same. You should not wear high heels. There were even reports that combined wearing handbags with high heels. That was even worse. And all these pieces of research were looked at existing shoes. So a high-heeled shoe of a certain height, one height higher, another height higher. And then padding, so all really based on existing footwear. So not kind of trying to find a new way of making a shoe in order to find ways, is there actually a better way of walking, or is there any improvement, or are there any opportunities possible?